We're still here.
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 So how do you tell the complete story of a football club with 125 years of history? The truth is, you probably can't. But what we're going to do instead is provide you with some snapshots from the history of this, our club, our Manchester City. Just like Manchester City, we might get it wrong some of the time. So where do we begin? Well, actually, we start 139 years ago in West Gorton.
So as you may know, it's the 125th anniversary coming shortly. But did you know that that's not where it all started? St Mark's Gorton might be something that you've heard whilst being at City. You may have even seen some of the black shirts with the white emblem on. But do you know where it all started from? So as you can see behind me, we're here at what was St Mark's Church of England Parish Church. Anna Connell, daughter of St Mark's rector Arthur Connell, believed that introducing male clubs would improve community spirit. With the help of church wardens William Beastow and Thomas Beddehair, and to curb local unrest within the community, what they decided to do was form a local football team which became St Mark's. There was already a St Mark's cricket club in the local community. There were not many opportunities for young men in the local area of East Manchester at the time, high levels of unemployment and high levels of crime. So Anna and the wardens decided to form a football club, considering that cricket was actually played in the summer. So they wanted something that could provide, a way out for some of the young men in the winter months. The first recorded match was on the 13th of November 1880 in typical City fashion, let's say. They recorded a 2-1 defeat to a church team from Macclesfield. In fact, St Mark's West Gorton only recorded one victory in the entirety of the season, and that was against Staleybridge Clarence in March 1881. So you may ask, why is that important? Well, basically, that was the first page in our history book of what is now Manchester City Football Club. Over the next few years, St Mark's West Gorton went through some radical changes. They lost their ground in 1884, forcing a merger with Bellevue. But not long later, after many disagreements and only one season, they parted company. St Mark's West Gorton went through many rebrands, and it was here that the first change happened, and changing the name to Gorton Association FC, which in theory ended the association with the Church of England. In the 84-85 season, saw Gorton Association FC join the Manchester and District Football Association. In 1886, Gorton Association FC were right up there with some of their contemporaries, and even beating what used to be one of their partners, Bellevue, who had now become West Gorton Athletic, 5-1 in a cup competition. Joy was short-lived though, when they were drawn against Newton Heath, which we now know as Manchester United. They were thumped 11-1.
Perhaps a somewhat inauspicious start for Manchester City then. This would prove to be the theme for our early years, reincarnation after reincarnation, eventually finding a somewhat lasting stability in Ardwick.
Change again was on the cards for the club, and in the summer of 1887, the club were evicted from their original ground, finally settling here in Ardwick. The club initially agreed to rent the land for £10 a month for a 7-month lease. This led to the next change in the club's history. The club would become Ardwick AFC, as it was no longer within the limits of Gorton. The new location for Ardwick AFC brought with it a new association with the Hyde Road Hotel. Hotel landlord Stephen Chesters Thompson agreed to let the club use the hotel facilities. In return, the club had to use his venue as a permanent fixture. This in turn allowed Thompson to rename the new stadium bars, and this is when Ardwick AFC got their first nickname, the Brewery Men. One last distinction and important change in the club's history was in 1887, with the move and merger with Thompson and Hyde Road Hotel. The club actually paid their first player 5 shillings, which led to the club becoming more of a professional organisation. In the 1888-89 season saw a new addition to the pitch at Ardwick AFC, and that was the introduction of the first new stand, which held a capacity of 1,000 fans. Manager Lawrence Furnish and backer John Allison went on many scouting trips around Scotland and the northwest of England to try and recruit better players. The club successfully signed goalkeeper William Douglas, left-back David Robson, and England winger David Weir, who would become instrumental for the club over the next few seasons. Ardwick AFC found their first cup success in 1891, beating Newton Heath 1-0 in the Manchester Cup. This victory was influential when the then Football Alliance accepted Ardwick AFC as a member for the 1891-92 season. The Football Alliance then merged in 1892 with the Football League, and Ardwick AFC became founding members of the Football League's Division 2. All was looking promising for Ardwick AFC until the 1893-94 season. Financial troubles at the club led to reorganisation, and Ardwick turned into Manchester City. Manchester City becoming registered as a company on April the 16th, 1894. Manchester City was born, and Manchester City had its home here at Hyde Road Stadium, and between 1887 and 1923. The City faithful who used to cheer on their team here basically were well known for their exuberance, creating loud atmospheres with bugles and drums, even on occasions being known to don fancy dress. I wonder where that comes from. And inflatable bananas were sported even back then, maybe. In 1899, Manchester City FC had gained promotion to the First Division, and by 1904, Manchester City FC became the first Manchester team to win the FA Cup by beating Bolton Wanderers, and narrowly missed out on the Cup and League double by finishing runners-up in the First Division. The Hyde Road Stadium saw radical redevelopment in 1904. The club were producing results and silverware on the pitch, and the ground needed to house its ever-growing fan base, eventually resulting in a capacity of 40,000 with covered accommodation for 35,000 of those spectators.
So in 1894, Manchester City were officially born. How about that? Let's take a look at the early years of Manchester City. Of course, Manchester City became the first Manchester team to win a major piece of silverware, the FA Cup in 1904. And Manchester City were quite a competitive team even in the early years of football. We finished third in the 1904-1905 season. We finished third in the 1907-1908 season. Manchester United winning the league that year. In 1920-1921, Burnley won the league and Manchester City finished runners-up. In 1929-1930, Manchester City finished third again. Manchester City's next sort of period of dominance, as it were, started in the 1930s. In 1934, we won the FA Cup. We won the league in 1936 and 1937, and we also won the Community or Charity Shield in 1937-1938 season. In between all that, we finished as FA Cup runners-up in 1926, and again FA Cup runners in 1933. So let's go ahead and have a look at some of those players that really stood out in the early years of Manchester City.
A couple of years after World War I ended in 1921, Meredith returned to Manchester City after United reluctantly agreed to a free transfer. Meredith was now in his 40s and was a shadow of the former player. Meredith went on to feature in City's last ever game at Hyde Road in 1923 before they moved to their new state-of-the-art stadium, Maine Road. Meredith holds the record for being City's oldest ever player, aged 49. Meredith had managed to avoid major injuries during a very physical time in football due to his speed and his agility. This is a comment that he made to the media. "I have dedicated myself to football and I have become a better player than most men because I have denied myself much of what they prize." In his personal life, Meredith was married to Ellen Negus and they had 2 daughters. He wasn't as good in business as he was in football and was made bankrupt in 1909. In 1910, he ran a pub, which was strange with him being a teetotaler. He also went on to run the Stretford Road Hotel. Meredith died in Withington in 1958, aged 83, just 2 months after the Munich air disaster. Meredith insisted on being buried in an unmarked grave. The house that Meredith died in was actually 2 streets away from where I grew up myself, hence why I found this particular story very interesting. One tribute to Billy Meredith said, "He was a man that knew his own worth." He was a huge celebrity at the time, yet he was buried in an unmarked grave. He was a teetotaler, yet he ran a pub. He fought for players' rights. He fought against the establishment. He was a humble man from a humble background. That was Billy Meredith. He was contradictory until the last.
Max moved later in 1919 to Manchester for the purpose of work, gaining employment at the engineering firm Crosley Brothers. Well known for his footballing abilities, he was sought after by both Manchester football clubs. He asked the legend of Manchester football, Billy Meredith, where he should choose, and naturally, Billy advised him to sign for City. Due to work commitments and being an amateur, he decided he could only play in home games. Despite the City fans wanting to see their new signing, Woosnam asked to play in the reserves until he believed he was match fit. Max finally made his home debut on January the 1st, 1920 in a 1-0 win against Bradford City. At the end of that month, City travelled to Leicester for an FA Cup tie. Woosnam withdrew because of work commitments and City went on to lose 3-0. The fans were not happy that Max hadn't played, and rumours circulated that his employers had refused to allow him the time off, and they were made the scapegoats for the loss. This was not the truth. Max had made the decision as he believed his obligation first and foremost was to his job. A group of colleagues and employees of the firm sent a message to the board of directors saying that if Woosnam was not allowed to play for City, then they would go on strike. Crosley Brothers took the threat seriously and informed Max that he was obliged to play for City before work commitments. He only missed 3 games for the rest of that season, and City finished in 7th position.
History sometimes repeats itself in the most wonderful ways. This season, Manchester City's Brazilian goalkeeper Edison has rightfully been lauded for his distribution, and not simply for the consistent excellence of it, but the methods employed that veer so notably from the norm. His 5-a-side passing from the back has become a talking point. It brought initial scoffs of disbelief followed by admiration. So successful has it been that it's easy to imagine other keepers emulating his brave new style in years to come. Way back in the 1930s, another Manchester City stopper also challenged conventional thinking. In an era when goalies routinely bounced the ball twice before punting it downfield, Frank Swift began to throw the ball out to a teammate instead of kicking it long. It became a talking point. It brought initial scoffs of disbelief followed by admiration. So successful was the strategy that it directly inspired Tottenham's Ted Ditchburn to do likewise in the 50s, and Manchester United's Alex Stepney too a decade later. Swift's trailblazing was a consequence of common sense in that it was entirely logical to ensure that possession was retained rather than gamble on that occurring, and it was this willingness to widen the parameters of the status quo that led to the former coat-keeper for Blackpool Gasworks drawing diagrams after games of goals that he had conceded. What could he have done differently? Where could he improve? It's fair to state that Pep Guardiola would have absolutely loved Frank Swift, as we all would have. Swifty was a gentleman, but then again, that was hardly a rarity in an age when manners and decency was aspired to. But he also had a clownish humour that was coupled with a fierce intelligence, an aptitude that wore lightly. He was a giant on the pitch. He was a thoroughly lovely man off it.
Those were some players that featured with Manchester City during Manchester City's early years. They were greats. There were so many greats. There were other people that we could have talked about, like Matt Busby. All of these players are such legends of the game, and it's just a shame that if you watch football these days, you've got hours and hours of footage and interaction even with players. And back then, they were almost just normal people. But then you've got people like Max Woosnam, who was almost superhuman, a polymath of sport. These players also were around in a period of great upheaval for Manchester City. Only a new club in 1894. They, in some way, shape or form, were at Hyde Road from 1887 to 1923. Moving on to Maine Road, the club started to see this period of stability and success on the pitch. They were considered a great side, full of great players. And Manchester City really found their feet at what is considered by many the true ancestral home of the football club, Maine Road, Manchester.
By 1920, Manchester City were coming to the end of Hyde Road because they were beginning to outgrow that particular stadium, further enhanced by the fire in November of 1920 that destroyed the main stand. It still took a further 3 years before the move to what was become the iconic Main Road. Well, walking down here at Citizens Place, as you can see, it's completely different to my days of following Manchester City at Main Road. Obviously, we can see in the background here, we've got the original centre spot where it used to be, and I've got goosebumps, I must admit now, just talking about this, just being back here. I was here 5-6 years ago, but it was very much a rush journey, and today coming back here and just talking about my memories of Main Road and things like that, I've actually, like I said, I've got the hairs on the back of my neck are standing up. My first game was 1977, March 1977, and it was a 2-0 win against Norwich, Dennis Stewart scoring both of them. And in those days, I came with my dad and my uncle. My dad come down from Scotland, and my uncle was a massive Manchester City fan, and sort of basically converted my father into a Manchester City fan, and that's where it started. I was in the corner stand between the Kippax and the Claremont Road on basically the open area. On a day like this, you just get absolutely soaked wet through, but sitting on the shoulders of not only my dad but my uncle, and being passed around, you know, when they had enough of me on their shoulders. It was to somebody who I never even knew, they never even knew, only to say hello to on match days. So my memories of Main Road, I was fortunate enough to play there on a few occasions, and to walk out on the pitch for Manchester boys representing Manchester and playing at Main Road was just an absolute Jimmy Grimble moment, I'm guessing. It was an absolute privilege to play there. So I'm thinking now, where was I? Because I remember I played on the right wing, and if this is the circle here, there's obviously, you can see people taking photographs of it now. I'm guessing if we were this way, I was probably standing where I am now, maybe just to that way, with the goal over to my left hand side here. So yes, Main Road was just special, absolutely special, going as a young teenager, and with your mates, and you know, being allowed at 13 years of age to go on the bus from Wythenshawe and jumping off here and walking down the alleyways and things like that. I mean, it was different in those days. You wouldn't allow probably your kids to do that this day and age, but as you can see, kids are still coming today just to look and take photographs on what is the centre spot, or was the centre spot in the days of Main Road. So I've got absolutely brilliant memories. It's just amazing atmosphere, camaraderie, crap football if I'm being honest, but yeah, I wouldn't swap it for the world. Plans to build Main Road were announced in May 1922. Initially, the thoughts were they were going to build at Bellevue in East Manchester, but with a short-term lease and the size of restricted capacity, they decided against that. So it's decided that the club were going to build here, just where we are, Main Road in Moss Side, and we were here from 1923 until 2003. The first match played here was promising considering Manchester City's past. It was actually a game against Sheffield United, which Manchester City won 2-1 in front of 58,000 fans. Well, I'm here with Daniel and Paul. Why are you here today on this awful day?
Well, we've just been to the museum in town.
Oh, okay.
Football museum, and I've got a week off work, so I that's why I was dragging around them and showing them exactly where I spent my Saturdays.
We were just
as a
doing,
kid.
yeah, we were just doing a piece of camera there and just
Yeah.
trying to work out where was what and
Yeah.
which side was the Kipats.
Kipats to the left.
Kipats to the left.
North stand behind us,
Yeah.
flat lane, main stand.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. So what do you think being here? I know you never visited Maine Road
I
as a
never
kid.
came.
Well, it's good to know that my dad's been here and all.
Yeah.
Every City legend played on this place before.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
What are your memories of Maine Road?
Straight away, 1985, Charlton.
Yeah,
Exactly this spot.
yeah.
And the pitch invasion. And obviously David Pleat running that way in 1983. And probably Charlton was probably the best
Yeah.
memory, to be honest.
Or the 5-1.
The 5-1, 89.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I didn't go to that. I was working at Butlins in Bognor Regis at the time, so
Well, I was there, and it was a wonderful, wonderful
it
day.
certainly was, yeah. So obviously that didn't come straight to my memory. But yeah, brilliant times.
Yeah.
Proper old stadium and how it should be. To be honest, part of me wishes it was still here.
You really do you?
I never took to the City Manchester Stadium at the time, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Obviously now the Etihad is different,
Yeah.
taking the youngest and what have you, but yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, listen, I want to say a massive thank
Thank you very much.
to these two. It's absolutely pouring down, which is a
Typical
shame.
Mancunian weather.
Absolutely. Well,
But yeah.
perfect day.
Yeah, of course it is.
Well, listen, take
Yeah,
care.
thanks
Enjoy.
very much. All right, buddy.
What can be said about Maine Road, Manchester? Our home for 80 years. Legends of the game all played there for City and against City. There were many trophy successes. In 1956, Manchester City were crowned the FA Cup winners. Through the 60s, the Mercer-Allison years, winning the league in the 67-68 season, winning the FA Cup in 1969, European success in 1970. Yes, we do have some European success. Winning the League Cup in 1970-1976. To each person, if you were there at any point, Maine Road holds such personal memories of Manchester City. I unfortunately wasn't born until the 80s, so my earliest memories of Manchester City at Maine Road come late in the 80s. I was there in 89 when City thrashed Man United, and I was led to believe that Manchester City were, a great club, and they were a great club. We had such great players throughout all of those Maine Road years. Personally, I saw many promotions and relegations at the stadium. I saw Manchester City at their lowest ebbs. I started my life at Maine Road in the Platt Lane stand, and then migrated eventually to the North Stand as a young adult. But I remember the Kippax last stand in 94, going from a terraced shed. It wasn't the most attractive thing in the world. And then again, when they reopened the Kippax, what felt at the time to be a modern stand. I never witnessed Manchester City win anything of significance at Maine Road, not a trophy. In fact, that win over United in 89 was the last win that I'd see until the early 2000s against United. I saw relegations, a couple of promotions. I can't quite describe why Maine Road is such a important place. I think one of the things that can be said of Maine Road is that it always felt like it was the home of football fans. Yes, there were boxes, yes, there were corporates, but it was kind of out of sight, out of mind. Maine Road very much felt like the venue of the working class fan. It very much felt like there could never be judgment passed about the quality of your ticket or the price you'd paid for admission. And especially during the years that I was going there, it always felt like we were all in it together. Never any question of whether you were a new fan, an old fan, a glory hunter or not. You were just a City fan. And that place was always rocking, always buzzing. People stood up, cheering the worst football I've ever seen, quite frankly. So I'm going to let better people than myself tell you about a couple of periods of Manchester City's history.
I was just a small kid when I first went to Maine Road back in 1976. We drew with Queen's Park Rangers in a thrilling scoreless draw. My dad tells me I asked why the Queen wasn't there and which one was Georgie Best. I was only 5, so please don't judge me too harshly. He said the look on my face was a picture as we entered the stands. So many people. I guess it was my first ever time in a really big crowd. Maine Road was a proper football ground full of characters. It was also one of the more friendly places. My granddad loved his football and would take me and my brother to other grounds, but nothing could match City in Maine Road. Being a City supporter at the beginning of the 1970s must have been a bit like how we feel today. The club was experiencing its most successful period in its its history, with a group of players whose names will live on in City folklore for several generations to come. Joe Mercer and his assistant Malcolm-Allison have produced an exciting team, with a triumvirate of Bell, Lee and Summerby standing out as generally great players. Behind the scenes, Albert Alexander was the chairman, a popular man with a steady hand. The 1969-70 season ended in a cup double. All was well, or was it? In the 70-71 season, after a 1-0 defeat at Ellen Road, City were in 5th in the table. Malcolm-Allison was sacked and reinstated minutes later when Mercer said if Big Mal went, he went too. Allison was a supporter of having a new chairman at the club. Behind the scenes there was a power struggle going on. Gentleman Joe and Big Mal were on opposing sides. The double act was showing signs of cracking. City finished a disappointing 11th, whilst Arsenal completed a historic league and FA Cup double. City keeper and legend Joe Corrigan felt the magic was fading around the team Mercer and Allison had built. A few games into the following season, Allison was made team manager, taking control of affairs on the pitch. Joe was moved to the position of general manager. Albert Alexander's son Eric took over the role as chairman, and City were holding their own. In November they were 3 points off the top. In January they shared top spot with Leeds. Neil Young, our FA Cup hero in '69, left the club, unhappy with Allison. With 12 games left, City were 2 points clear. They signed Rodney Marsh in March. There was no transfer window in those days, but the signing disrupted a settled team and finished the season 4th, just 1 point off the top. Even Marsh agreed that he'd cost City winning the league. Joe Mercer blamed Allison for throwing away the title, thus sealing its fate. Franny Lee scored 35 goals that season, 15 from the penalty spot, most of which he'd earned by going down easily, some have said. It gave rise to the nickname Lee One Pen. Mercurial Brian Clough got Derby County over the line to win their first ever league championship. In late September 1972, ex-chairman Albert Alexander died on the same day City got a tanking at Stoke, losing 5-1 and ending the day bottom of the league. Knocked out of the League Cup by Bury, results did not improve for a while and they climbed out of the relegation danger zone. There were also financial problems and Ian Mellor was sold. By March, a terrible run of 7 defeats in 8 culminated in the sacking of Big Mal. Johnny Hart, a City man through and through, became caretaker manager and results improved. City finished 11th. For the Rags it was worse. They ended up in 18th. The Dippers won the league. The 1973-74 season saw a change in the boardroom. Eric Alexander stepped down and the much maligned Peter Swales took over. He would keep the role as chairman for 20 years. Some of the decisions that were made during his tenure had lasting repercussions for the club. On the pitch, Dennis Law made his return to City from United. This was City's 50th season at Maine Road. City made it to Wembley in the League Cup final, but lost 2-1 against Wolves. It was not a great season for City, finishing the campaign in 14th. Johnny Hart had to step down as manager due to health reasons in the October. Tony Buck filled in as caretaker boss before Swales appointed Ron Saunders. Saunders once told Mike Doyle, "Listen, I don't want my back four to play football. If you get the ball, just lump it forward and we'll go from there." He did bring in Dennis Chewett, who was one of my idols in later years. Saunders didn't make the end of the season and was sacked in the April. City legend Tony Buck taking charge and would remain boss until 1979. One game that is well remembered from the season is the derby at Old Trafford. Dennis Law scoring from a back heel, which consigned United to a 1-0 defeat. United were already relegated, but it didn't stop the legend beginning that City and ex-United favourite Law had sent them down. The United fans invaded the pitch and the game was abandoned on 85 minutes. However, the FA decided the result would stand. The following season, Tony Buck sold Francis Lee. A strange decision indeed. Rodney Marsh made comment on the sale in his book. Before the season kicked off, Buck made the first of many cock-ups by selling Francis Lee to Derby for £110,000. In doing so, Buck didn't just shoot himself in the foot, he almost blew City's legs off. The really comical thing about the transfer was that Buck signed Barney Daniels from non-league Telford as Franny's replacement. I just shook my head when I heard, because that was when I knew Manchester City were about to turn a silk's purse into a sow's ear. Also at the start of that season, Dennis Law went into retirement. City were a force at home and a disaster away. Their home form meant they stayed away from trouble. Joe Corrigan wasn't a regular during the season and told the media he felt he was being mistreated. Tony Buck put him on the transfer list, commenting, "I'm not looking for a lot of money. Any sensible offer will be given consideration. Seems unbelievable that he'd allow Big Joe to leave." He got back in nets due to an injury to Keith McRae. Unfortunately, the silliness stopped. City finished 8th, United were promoted. In the summer of '75, Dave Watson was bought from Sunderland, and City continued this season with great home form and complete garbage on the road. A bust-up between Tony Buck and Rodney Marsh, there wasn't much love between the two, resulted in Marsh being transfer listed and never pulling on the sky blue shirt again. It would seem that many players were disgruntled with Marsh at the time. Dennis Stewart said in his autobiography that many players had been to see the manager about Rodney. In his place, Mike Doyle was made captain. City played United in a 4th round League Cup tie and smashed them 4-0. It should have been a night to celebrate, but that cart horse Martin Buchan badly injured our hero Colin Bell in the challenge. It'd be a long time before arguably City's greatest ever player was back on the pitch. City's away form improved, but a poor Christmas saw City in 7th. City made it to the final of the League Cup final, beating Middlesbrough with youngsters Kenny Clements, Paul Power, Jed Keegan and my 70s hero Peter Barnes on the pitch. They won 4-0 in the second leg at Maine Road, setting up a final with Newcastle. Marsh was sold to Tampa Bay and was announced as the White Pele. Rodney retorted that Pele was the Black Rodney Marsh. At Wembley, City beat Newcastle. Peter Barnes scored the first. They equalised, and then Dennis Stewart won the game with an overhead kick. The 1976 League Cup was City's last trophy for a long time, and I'm sure there's many of us who have the mental scars to prove it. City finished the season in 8th, once again. Their away form, 2 wins out of 21 being the Achilles heel. Joe Corrigan was City's player of the season. What a difference a season makes. In the summer before the 76-77 season, Brian Kidd was signed, a terrific player who, like Billy Meredith before him, crossed the divide in Manchester. Kiddo is still part of the City setup and has been a success as a coach at both Manchester clubs. However, going out of the door was a City legend, Alan Oakes. No man has played for City more times than him, totaling 676 games. City were knocked out of Europe by Juventus in the first round, losing 2-1 in aggregate, but our league form was good throughout the season. We had a 17-match unbeaten run from the end of October to mid-February, and we were at one point favourites to win the league, but away defeats at Old Trafford and Anfield saw the title race get nervy. It was a 4-0 loss at Derby at the end of April which saw the odds change in Liverpool's favour. City then hammered Spurs, who were relegated, 5-0, drew at home with Everton and finally won 1-0 away at Coventry. We finished 1 point behind Liverpool as runners-up. To begin the 77-78 campaign, City signed striker Mick Channon and kicked off the season in fine form, not losing a game until October the 4th, including stuffing United 3-1 at Maine Road. October was a funny month where we lost to Coventry, Wolves and Forest and beat Arsenal and Liverpool. In November, a Dennis Stewart hat-trick against Chelsea helped City to a 6-2 victory. Stewart was on the transfer list at his own request at the time. On Boxing Day at half-time against Newcastle it was 0-0. Then, replacing Paul Power for the second half, came the emotional return of Colin Bell. It inspired City to a 4-0 win, Stewart with another hat-trick. City went on a 6-game winning streak, but at the end of January were knocked out of both cups in the space of a week. Stewart left the Blues for America, joining New York Cosmos. A decent end to the season saw City finish 4th. We got off to a bad start to the next season, and a game I remember was a home loss to Liverpool. It ended 4-1. I don't remember much of the game, but it was the first time I witnessed the scourge of 70s and 80s football hooliganism. I remember sat in the main stand watching Liverpool's fans trying to take the Kipak stand as a 7-year-old boy. Sat next to my dad wondering what was going on. I remember him saying he'd never take us to see the Dippers ever again, and he never. His opinion has always been City are a lovely family club. He being a Blackpool fan but a lover of good football in general, he went to Maine Road years before I was born in 71. I never felt frightened because I was with him, but I can imagine how he felt. I take my lad with me now and it's a very different experience, but the mental scars of hooliganism remain. Don't get me wrong, it was still the best place to be, always has been, wearing your scarf on your wrist, looking out for the BBC lorries to see if we would be on Match of the Day, watching your heroes, hearing the Kipaks sing and hearing Helen's bell. Unfortunately, violence went hand in hand with football in this era. It was often brutal, and if you got home without incident, you'd done well. The early season form improved, and by the end of October we were up to 5th. In November we signed the talented Polish star Kazdania. City beat AC Milan 5-2 over 2 legs in a third round UEFA Cup tie. Our form dipped after that, and at the beginning of 1979 saw the return of the flamboyant, fedora-wearing, cigar-smoking Malcolm Allison to assist Tony Buck. The truth was, Allison was back in charge, and with that he began to dismantle the team. City finished the season in 15th. Allison sold Brian Kidd, Dave Watson, Gary Owen, Peter Barnes, Kenny Clements and Asa Hartford. How he was allowed to replace these fans' favourites with lesser players for big transfer fees, God only knows. Peter Barnes said, "Some of Mal's decisions didn't make sense. He sold established international players. He thought Nicky Reed was going to be the new Bobby Moore. He wanted to build the side around him. He said that to my dad." Ken was incredulous. He just said, "You what?" In came Bobby Shinton, who Swales thought could be the next Mike Summerby, Michael Robinson from Preston, and Steve McKenzie from Palace at $250,000, making him Britain's most expensive teenager at the time. Mick Shannon was dropped for criticising Allison's tactics. To make matters worse, Colin Bell's fight to get fit ended as he retired. Allison then broke the British transfer record for Wolves' Steve Daly for $1.45 million. Stuart Lee and Barry Silkman arrived, and out went Channon to Southampton. The form didn't improve, and City spent $1 million on Kevin Reeves. Allison claiming he is the nearest thing to today's soccer to Kevin Keegan. City were knocked out of the FA Cup by Halifax Town, losing 1-0. Dennis Chewett returned from New York. Willie Donachie was next to leave. It was a disastrous turn for Big Mal. His wish to promote youth and sell established internationals was failing. After everything he had done for this club in his first spell, it was threatening to damage his legend. A late rally at the end of the season saw City finish 17th. Swales commented, "The most traumatic season of my career in the game. Never will I allow, as long as I am chairman, such wholesale changes. I can never be a party to such a massive gamble at any time in the future."
City's decline towards the end of the 70s was the start of a massive downturn for Manchester City. Now, we did have one last sort of hurrah. We ended up in the FA Cup final in 1981 against Tottenham Hotspur at Wembley. We actually drew the game at Wembley 1-1, and it finished 1-1 after extra time, which meant in those days it went to a replay. We lost the replay 3-2, and Ricky Villa scored a famous winner. The decline was such at the club that you all know that late 60s period and that last trophy, the League Cup in 1976, was the last City trophy until 2011. 34 years. Peter Swales was the chairman of the club at the time. Different managers were brought in. The playing staff was rotated massively. City's formula of playing young local lads was being overrun. Former heroes of the club, both on the managerial staff and the playing staff, were leaving the club as villains, and it only got worse as we go into our next period.
Manchester City began the 1990s with optimism and a bright-looking future under Howard Kendall, with City playing a good brand of football and challenging Manchester United for City dominance. However, Kendall left City in November 1990 to become once again Everton manager, referring to his time at City as an affair and Everton as his perfect marriage. As much as this was a blow for the Blues, Peter Reid took up the mantle as Blues manager in November 1990 and started strongly. Manchester City finished 5th, one place above neighbours Manchester United, and equalled this achievement the following season. In the first season of the Premier League 92-93, City slipped into 9th place with an increasingly stale brand of long ball football, and Reid was sacked after a poor start to the following season. Reid managed to bring in players such as Keith Curle and Terry Phelan for £2.5 million each, showing the ambition that the board did have for their managers and were willing to make top signings. Following Reid's sacking, Peter Swales appointed Brian Horton in 1993 and brought with him an attacking brand of football, which was demanded and craved by loyal Blues far and wide. Attacking flair players such as Peter Beagre, Uwe Rosler, Paul Walsh and Nicky Summerbet, the son of the club legend Mike. Although an attacking brand of football was played with results such as the 5-2 win over Tottenham and the 4-0 drubbing of Everton at Maine Road, the results were never consistent, and City finished near the bottom in Horton's full season in charge of the club. City were on a downward trend. Horton was sacked at the end of the 93-94 season following a shocking run of results which only included 4 wins in the final 25 games of that season, a record that new chairman Francis Lee would not forgive. Horton, despite his failings, did bring joy and excitement to the Maine Road masses, with signings such as Gary Flitcroft and Steve Lomas to go alongside his attacking players such as Beagre, Walsh and Rosler. Francis Lee became the chairman in 1994 after acquiring 3 million shares from former chairman Peter Swales. Swales was a ruthless businessman and took his ruthlessness into the football world, sacking manager after manager. The fans had had enough. They called time on Swales with protests to oust him from the role at Maine Road and to bring in club legend Francis Lee. Protests would become commonplace at the club, unfortunately, during this time, as the fans would protest Swales out and Lee in. These same fans would protest 3 to 4 years later to get Francis Lee out of the club. Francis Lee did do a huge amount for the club, however, including a redevelopment of the famous Kippax stand in the 90s. The Kippax was one of the best known and vocally active terrace stands at Manchester City's Main Road. Originally the popular site when the stadium opened in 1923, its name was changed in 1956 when the club gained planning permission to build a roof to shield the fans from the cold, wet and the rain. It was named after Kippax Street, which ran alongside of the ground. The Kippax was actually unusual in that, like most other grounds, it occupied a full side rather than just an end of a ground, such as Liverpool's Cop, Manchester United's Stretford End, Everton's Gladys Street, Newcastle's Gallowgate and Aston Villa's Holt End. Unfortunately, in the summer of 1994, due to the brand new Taylor report that had come out, the Kippax had to be demolished. An all-new seater stand was built in its place and opened by City legend Bert Troutman in October of 1995. Its first game would be used during the 95-96 season in the summer of August against Tottenham. It housed over 10,000 seated fans, had 3 tiers and was at the time the highest stand in the whole of the country. City was becoming a toxic environment, and as the 90s went on became more and more toxic. Lee, after sacking Horton, pulled for his former England teammate and personal friend Alan Ball to take up the City hot seat for the beginning of the 95-96 season and splashed the cash to bring players like Kit Symons, former German international goalkeeper Ike Immel, and for a fee of around £2 million, a little Georgian maestro by the name of George Kinkladze. The season began on a bright August summer weekend with a home game against Spurs with a 1-1 draw, with Ube Rosler scoring for the Blues. However, the season didn't get much better until a 1-0 home win in November against Bolton Wanderers, which was then followed up in the same week by a 1-0 home win over Brian Little's Aston Villa team. City were in a relegation battle, and the fans knew it, Lee knew it, and most importantly of all, Ball knew it. City fought hard to keep their Premier League status towards the end of the season, with wins against Sheffield Wednesday and away to Aston Villa. The last game of the season was at home to Roy Evans' Liverpool. City needed a win to stay up, and hoped results at Coventry, Southampton and Sheffield Wednesday went for them. Soon, City were 2-0 down through goals from Ian Rush and Steve McManaman. City fought back bravely through a Rosler penalty and a Kit Symons equaliser. And then, through the handheld radios, fans started to believe that a 2-2 draw was actually good enough. This was false information. City was staying up. Players were wasting time with the ball, just passing it around. Steve Lomas took the ball over to the corner and wasted time until Niall Quinn frantically ran out onto the side, shouting a winner was needed. And try as they might, City couldn't get the winner. The club were relegated. Quinn said after the game, big cloud descended on the club that day. Little did we know, the cloud would become a thunderstorm when a hurricane rolled into one. Ball started the 96-97 season in the newly branded Nationwide League, with City as hot favourites to make an automatic return to the big time. The season began on a Friday night at home to Ipswich Town, another promotion favourite. Time for the Blues to lay down an early season marker, which they did with a 1-0 win. One thing was for certain, no matter what the division, the fans were there. Ball lasted 3 games until leaving, stating that the club's financial plight that was only getting worse had forced him to sell his gems such as Steve Lomas, Flitcroft and other players. Fortunately to a lot of fans, Kinkladze had chosen to stay. City appointed Asa Hartford as caretaker manager till a full-time manager could be found, which was to be United legend Steve Coppell, to everyone's amazement. This did not last long. 33 days later, Coppell quit, citing pressure and the stress of the job that he could no longer overcome. He had to leave. Caretaker managers were appointed again, with this time Phil Neal taking the reins till a permanent successor could be found. City were not living up to their tag as promotion favourites and were mid-table looking downwards, when eventually Frank Clark was appointed the permanent manager in December of 1997. He did manage to steady the ship, leading the club to a 14th place finish that season. The club was drowning under millions of pounds of debt. Clark started the 97-98 season with a new kit sponsoring Kappa, the new optimism with the record signing of Lee Bradbury coming in from Portsmouth for £3 million. The club were in debt but still tried to back the manager. Bradbury had a great scoring record for Portsmouth in the lower leagues. However, his time at City was very much like the club, on a downward spiral. The club continued to sign players in Gerard Vikings and fullback Tony Vaughan for £1.35 million. City now had over 40 professional footballers on their book, but had managed to keep the gem in the fans' eyes in Kincladze, with a new 3-year contract signed, making him the highest paid player in the club's history. The fans had begged, pleaded with Gio to sign on the last day of the 96-97 season at home to Reading, singing, chanting, begging the little Georgian to sign a new contract, and he wasn't even involved in the actual game. However, behind the scenes, Kincladze was the anchor weighing the club down, especially in the lower leagues, as on a wet Tuesday night, in a swirling wind at Port Vale, Kincladze looked far from the maestro the fans loved. He looked uninterested and not up for the fight. Players had learned how to beat City, kick Kincladze, and City were done for. Clark knew this, and behind the scenes, Clark and Kincladze were at loggerheads, and it didn't get any better. Clark's final games in charge came at Maine Road on the 14th of February 1998, which became a Valentine's Day massacre. Bury was now City's local derby. Not Manchester United. Bury turned up at Maine Road under the lights, and a packed Maine Road, and rose to the occasion as City wilted. Stanton's Bury left Maine Road that night with a 1-0 win, the lowest City had fell. City, who had began the early 90s under Kendall, challenging and finishing above a newly appointed United manager Alex Ferguson, to now being beat by Bury at Maine Road. The mitre had fallen. The trapdoor to League One, old Division 3, was opening for City. Clark was sacked following the Bury game, with hundreds of fans protesting after Lee and Clark to be removed. I did tell you it wouldn't be the last protest earlier on. The fans had had enough. At the time, we didn't realise we would have to take so much more. Clark was sacked and found out over the local radio airwaves, which basically summed up City. Even sacking a manager in the 90s became a mockery. Thankfully, to the fans' amazement and to the fans' joy, club legend Joe Royle was appointed not long after to help steer the club to Division 1 safety. With the help of club legend in the negotiations Dennis Stewart, Royle was back at Maine Road. Joe Royle was finding the club was in a complete mess, on the field and off the field, from leaky roofs to players he didn't even realise he had. The story goes, and a lot of City fans will have actually heard this story, Joe Royle turned the corner one day. He thought he'd found a cleaner. Turned out to be one of his fullbacks. There is no punchline to that. City had over 50 full-time players on their books. City were becoming the joke of not only their city, but amongst football. Joe Royle went out and spent what most fans would say is the best £400,000 they have ever spent by going to Bristol City and bringing in a Manchester United old boy, a striker you may have heard of, Sean Goater. The fans learnt very, very quickly that if you did feed the goat, he will score. City went into the final day of that season away at Stoke City, needing to win. Not only to win, but for other results to go for them. City went on to produce one of the best performances that season. A 5-2 away win in front of the packed away end at the Britannia Stadium. Yes, City had won, but so had everyone else. City were going down again, and going down hard, to a level never seen before. The third tier of English football. City had gone from playing Manchester United in their local derby to next season it's Macclesfield Town. City started the 98-99 season as pre-season favourites to making an immediate return. Players such as Kincladze had now been moved on to Ajax for a fee of over £5 million. The club desperately required that to stay afloat. Rossler returned to Germany with Kaiserslautern. Bradbury moved on to Crystal Palace. Joe Royle's Dogs of War players were brought in through forward Danny Allsop, an Australian quick forward, Gareth Taylor, Jamie Pollock from Bolton Wanderers. All were brought in to start the new look Manchester City. One signing was made that was in the mould of Joe Royle, the Dogs of War Joe Royle, and that player was Andy Morrison. Some fans, a lot of football fans in general, will say this is the best £40,000 ever spent by any club. The enforcer. He didn't even look right for a football pitch. more of a rugby pitch. Morrison immediately showed his no-nonsense attitude and woke the team up, even chipping in with an amazing goal away to Oldham in a rare away 3-0 win. However, City and the fans were struggling to adapt to life in the lower leagues, where every game was the cup final for their opponents. Packed houses greeted Royals men as though the FA Cup or league title was on the line. However, one thing stayed constant throughout this: the fans. Not once did the fans lose hope, even going away to York and getting beat 2-1. City went on a great run during this season after December. The 2-1 defeat from York still fresh in their minds. They put it behind them and charged up the table. They managed just to miss out on the second place that season, which would have put City up automatically, but they had left themselves too much to do. The playoffs it was, and what followed will remain part of City's history forever. The Blues entered a two-legged playoff against Wigan Athletic, and after a disastrous start against Wigan at the now demolished Springfield Park, where Wigan took a very early lead through Stuart Barlow due to an error between Vikings and goalkeeper Nicky Weaver, City stayed in the game at a windy stadium, equalising through Paul Dickoff. The second leg was played at Maine Road, under the lights, packed stadium, the fans demanding no failures. 31,305 fans made the atmosphere electric. City survived a scare early on when a penalty appeal for Wigan was waved away after clumsy challenge by Gerard Vikings. City soon took the game to Wigan with goal to Dickoff, Kevin Horlock, all missing good chances until the goat got onto the end of a cross with what happened to be his left arm at the time, scored the goal. Maine Road erupted. Despite the protest from Wigan goalkeeper Roy Carroll and the Wigan players, the goal stood and the game finished 1-0. The tie was 1-2-1. City were going to Wembley. 76,935 Gillingham, Manchester City supporters packed into Wembley. The Blues, who had begged, stealed and borrowed to get a ticket, were there, and what they witnessed was something they would never ever forget. City did not play amazing football that day. Both teams started the game nervously, cautiously. Half time, 0-0. No inch given by either side. Late into the second half, Carlos Arbor gave Gillingham a 1-0 lead. Bob Taylor, 2-0. City were down. Then suddenly the board showed 5 minutes of injury time. A loud, gut-wrenching roar came from the City end, and the fans at Axley were still in the ground. 91st minute, Kevin Horlock, one back. All of a sudden, City had the initiative in their now famous lazy yellow and navy striped shirt. City, you could hear them all from Manchester to London demanding for the equalising goal. The ball dropped to Sean Goulter. He took a shot, it's blocked. It falls to Paul Dickoff. The net bulges. 2-2. City were back from the dead with the last kick of the game. The game went into a very drab and dreary extra time. The fans, the players, everyone was emotionally drained. Penalties it was. City fans prayed, crossed everything. City had scored 3 of their first 4 penalties, with ironically Paul Dickoff missing against his best friend Vince Bertram. Gillingham had only scored 1 of their first 3. Gillingham stepped up. They needed to score to stay in this, or City were back. Weaver stood tall, proud in the net, saved the penalty to huge roars from the City fans. City were back up. The players celebrated. The fans were emotionally drained. Fans had managed to get back in the stadium to watch the remainder of the game. Royal had done it. He had masterminded his team back to the second tier of English football. The Premier League seemed possible again. And believe it or not, going into the 2000s, it actually did start to become a possibility.
I still get goosebumps when I think back to that 99 game against Gillingham. I was in my late teens at the time. It was my first ever trip to Wembley. And City was still on the bones. You know, United the week before had sealed a historic treble, and City was scraping barely past Gillingham. Joe Royal took us up again the following season, the 99-2000 season, with a dramatic last day trip to Ewood Park that I was also at, and we invaded the pitch at the end there. We almost tried doubling the capacity of Ewood Park, filling it out, because I don't think Blackburn fans had paid much attention to Blackburn since they won the league in 1995. And then over the next couple of years, we got relegated again, then back into the Premier League, and it was the Keegan era. Keegan had a very exciting brand of football in Division 1, but in the Premier League he just about brought us stability. And then we had our final season at Maine Road, 2002-2003, was probably one of the most emotional days of my life, which sounds crazy, but I love Manchester City. And it was time for a new beginning. New beginning, same manager, same players. Nothing much was to really improve in the early 2000s. We weren't winning any silverware. We weren't even coming close to competing for any silverware, but we had a new home, and it was time to embrace a new life there.
So we're here at the former site of the Bradford Colliery, Eastlands, Manchester, which is now home to Manchester City Football Club since our move from where we were at Maine Road for over 80 years. The Eastlands redevelopment started in 1999. Manchester basically had some failed bids for the Summer Olympics in 1996 and 2000 until they were successful in the bid for the Commonwealth Games in 2002. The stadium was reported to have cost £110 million and was funded by Sport England and Manchester City Council. There was a massive need for reinvestment in the area around Eastlands, and the redevelopment of this area was really needed by the local community. After the 2002 Commonwealth Games, Eastlands, or the City of Manchester Stadium, became vacant and needed a new tenant. Manchester City agreed to sign an extended lease with this particular stadium, and the Manchester City players, coaching staff and its fans moved here for the new start of the season in 2003. After moving 5 miles north to the City of Manchester Stadium, where originally it had a capacity of 38,000, after a £22 million investment, the stadium capacity increased to 48,000. The first game at the City of Manchester Stadium was in fact a friendly against Barcelona on the 10th of August 2003, resulting in a 2-1 win for Manchester City, with the person scoring the first goal, Nicolas Anelka. The first competitive game at the City of Manchester Stadium was against the New Saints in the UEFA Cup competition, and that was due to the previous season Manchester City going through on a UEFA's Fair Play Awards because of receiving the fewest yellows and red cards. City went on to win that game 5-0, but later crashed out the competition against a team called Gorton, sort of setting the scene for what was to come in European competitions for Manchester City. The new 48,000-seater capacity meant that more and more Manchester City faithful could squeeze into the new City of Manchester Stadium from the original 35,000 capacity at Maine Road. City's first home game of the new Premier League season was against Portsmouth, ending in a 1-1 draw. Now, the previous season City finished 9th, but this particular season we finished 16th, winning 9 games, 5 of them here at the City of Manchester Stadium. There were brief flashes of the brilliance of Kevin Keegan as our manager that particular season. We saw players like Stephen Ireland, Sean Wright-Phillips, resulting in a 6-2 win against Bolton Wanderers and also a 4-1 victory against our arch rivals Manchester United. And even though we were really excited at seeing that sort of young talent on display, we were back in the big time, but barely. From 2000 to 2010, Manchester City brought through quite a number of young kids in the academy. We had the likes of Stephen Ireland, Neda Manua, Micah Richards, Sean Wright-Phillips, Joey Bart. That's a significant number of kids that came through the academy and played for Manchester City during that decade. Some of the players throughout that decade who were certainly some of my favourites. We had Richard Dunn, obviously signed in the year 2000 and finished his career at Manchester City in 2009, playing 352 games, consistent performer, voted player of the season year after year after year. Thought he was a great captain for Manchester City, even though he did get lots of red cards. Another favourite of mine was the left midfielder Danny Tiatto. Absolutely loved him. I know he signed pre-2000, but he was there in the early days up till 2004. And he just had that long busted driving sort of nastiness, but had a wonderful, wonderful left foot. He eventually left the club in 2004 after 58 games. We also had Ali Benabia, one of my early sort of 2000s favourite. What an absolutely incredible player. We didn't have him long enough, and I wish we would have got him maybe a couple of years earlier, but he was at the club from 2001 to 2003. He was the predecessor really for today's David Silva. What a wonderfully gifted player. Another big name player we got at the time, which was amazing, was Nicolas Anelka, 2002 to 2005. He played 103 games and obviously had a wonderful partnership in the early days with Sean Gota, played over 103 times. One of our other captains, Sylvain Distam, 2002 to 2007. He played over 200 games for Manchester City. I thought he was a great leader, and again a precursor to the Vincent Kompany style of leadership on the pitch. There's got to be obviously mentions for Nicky Weaver, 1998, and eventually left the club after injuries in 2007, and nobody will forget the 99 Gillingham playoff. If we talk about some of the games in that particular decade, I mean, going back to an obvious one, which is the 2002-2003, the last derby at Maine Road, which I was there. It was absolutely crazy. Obviously, as you all know, City won 3-1. Sean Goater scored 2 goals. He also got his 100th goal for City that particular game. But what stands out for me is the noise. It was just incredible. And I know we've had some big nights at the Etihad against Liverpool and against Spurs and things, but nothing really, for me, has come close to that particular noise that we had certainly that day and many others at Maine Road. So that was a special moment for me in particular. And then obviously we moved through to the next following season, the 2004 famous cup game against Spurs. We were 3-0 down, and we also had Joey Barton sent off at half time for I think a second bookable. I can't remember whether it was a straight red or what, but I remember he put in a nasty challenge against Michael Brown, got a yellow card, could have got sent off, and then he did something at half time. I can't remember. He went to the referee and said something. Anyway, that put us down to 10 men. 3 brilliant goals by Spurs, by the way, and you were just looking typical City. And then next minute's 3-1, 3-2, 3-all, and then Michael Tarnack's left-footed cross to the back post, and John Macken climbing and planting the header straight back across Casey Keller to make it 4-3, and City held on for a famous victory. Now I remember not long after that game, this is just a personal memory, I was actually flying out to Seattle to go to Boeing, and I was in business class, and sat across the way was Casey Keller, and I remember talking to him in the galley, and I just quickly had a little chat about him and reminded him as a City fan of that particular game, and he just laughed and took it on the chin. Then obviously we moved through to sort of 2005, and one of our mainstays, which was Sean Wright-Phillips, and we knew at that moment in time that the club is in real financial difficulty, and we sold Sean Wright-Phillips, I think, for around about £21 million, and rumours were that potentially saved the club from going into administration. So that's how low we were back in 2005. Then obviously in 2007, Thaksin Shinawatra came along, as we later called him, Frank, and bought out Manchester City for £81 million. And at that time we're thinking, wow, £81 million being invested into the club, and he's bought this club and he's bringing in Sven-Goran Eriksson, and this is just incredible. And I remember we got Giovanni, and he scored the only goal against Manchester United when we won 1-0. And that season, actually, we were top 4 for a number of months, and thinking, God, this is really good. This is a real turning point. But as usual, we sort of fell away that particular season, and even though the players seemed to really, really like Sven, it ultimately ended in that horrendous 8-1 loss to Middlesbrough at the end. And I think the fractions that were happening between Sven and Frank at the time, that was basically the final nail in the coffin for Sven-Goran Eriksson. Then in 2008, we were bought out by this sheikh from Abu Dhabi, and at the time, you can remember all the fake banknotes, shake pictures on and things like that, and suddenly we've got Mark Hughes in charge, and there's pictures of Mark Hughes and Robinho, the ex-Real Madrid player, at the time one of the world stars, holding up a shirt, and he's signing for my club. And it's like, oh my God, I thought the Thaksin Shinawatra buyout was great news, but suddenly we've got players like Robinho coming to my club, Manchester City. Robinho, really? Now obviously it didn't really work out, but Mark Hughes came along, and we then started to spend, and I'll be honest with you, Mark Hughes I couldn't really take to him for whatever reason. And I know some City fans think that he was a really good manager, but there was just something there I just couldn't take to him, probably because of his association with Manchester United. You know how fickle fans are. And going back to that goal he scored at Maine Road when we beat United 5-1. So yeah, I never really took to him. And I remember taking my kids on a stadium tour back in 2008. They must have been, I don't know, 8 or 9 or 7. And I remembered speaking to the person who was taking us around on the tour, and we were talking about Mark Hughes. They turned around and said, he's a very, very cold manager. I mean, doesn't let on, doesn't like the players talking to anybody but staff members, and he's a real disciplinarian. And basically he was intimating that not many people around the club liked him as a person. So, but what I do remember from that time in 2008 is one thing, and that was Gary Cook. As we know, Gary Cook went out over, and he was in the States talking about the fact that we're going to sign all these players, and we're going to get Kaká, and everyone's going, what? Kaká coming to Manchester City at the time was in the top sort of 3-4 footballers in world football. I'm guessing, and no disrespect to other clubs, but it's like Sheffield United being taken over by a billionaire and saying, we're going to sign Mbappe, or we're going to sign Neymar, or Lionel Messi, or something like that. I mean, Kaká was right in the top tree of football at that time. For City fans, we were just thinking, oh my God, this is just incredible that we're being even spoken about. But one thing that did stand out to me, and it was an interview, I think, with Noel Gallagher. And Noel Gallagher said he'd spoken to Gary Cook and talking about who's coming to City and which players are we going to sign. And I think Noel Gallagher said he opened up a piece of paper and showed me the names of 10 players. He said, and I looked at it, and he said, don't ever tell anybody this, but these are the players that we're going to bring into Manchester City. And I remember Noel Gallagher saying, oh my Lord, when I saw the names on that list, I knew we were going back into the big time. So it's true to his word. Gary Cook did a great job at City. Onwards and upwards. Moving through just towards the end, I just want to give a couple of shout outs finally to 2 players that I really, really loved watching and playing together. And one of them was only there for a very, very short period, and that was Craig Bellamy. But at the same time, we bought Carlos Tevez, and that massive big sign, that welcome to Manchester sign, and it was then you knew this club was going in the right direction. Through all the heartache and pain of Derby losses, suddenly there was this swagger about Manchester City. There was this confidence that we're here to stay, and we're going to do something with this club, and we're going to tell you about it. And it was almost like the first shot across the bow to Manchester United and to the Premier League to say, we're back in the big time. I just loved watching Bellamy and Tevez together, their energy. I mean, it's almost like looking today at, Raheem Sterling, Bernardo Silva, 2 wonderful players that just gave everything for the cause. And then obviously in later years, the Carlos Tevez cupping his hands to his ears at Gary Neville and Alex Ferguson, and that was it. We were back in the big time.
City first launched a women's team back in 1988, so over 30 years ago. Manchester City Ladies, as it was then, and it was founded and managed by Neil Mather. City won 4-1 in their first ever game, and Donna Haynes was the first ever Manchester City Ladies goal scorer. The club continued through the 90s and 2000s, and people like Gail Redston, who was the captain, became really important in keeping the club alive at that time. As we know, the club on a whole went through some quite dark times in the 90s and through those times, and it was the work of people like Gail that made sure the club continued and still managed to run. In 2014, we became professional and the name was changed to Manchester City Women, and that's when the club really, really got behind it. So brought in players like Steph Horton, Karen Bardsley, Jill Scott, who were top class international players, and I think through the years that followed, it meant we've really kind of mirrored the success of the men's team at that time. So in the first season as professional, they won the Continental Cup, so they went on to win that again in 2016 and 2019. They won the league in 2016, FA Cup in 2017 and 2019, and it was fantastic to see the players last year after the double win, the women players on the trophy parade alongside the men's team. I think that goes a long way in showing that the club respect and value both teams in the same way.
Who are City now? It's a hard question to answer, really. If you ask a City fan, they'd say that they're the most adored, loved football team in the entire world. If you ask someone in the media, they'd probably say filthy oil money. If you asked an opposition fan for that matter, they'd probably say the same. But what City are now is an incredibly balanced, future-thinking, almost future-proof footballing community. Now I say community because there is so much inclusion in the modern club. Families, foreign fans, fans from any cultural or social background. City's origins were in the poorest parts of one of the poorest cities in the developed world. The fans traditionally have always been very hard, working class, humble people. The first 20 or so years of watching Manchester City, I saw us do nothing but get relegated and be a joke of a club in many people's eyes. The last 10 years of watching Manchester City, I've seen nothing but the greatest success. I've seen a brand, I've seen a team grow from strength to strength. I've seen people invest money properly in a project with longevity. I've seen friends of mine who for years have suffered alongside me smile and laugh and take great joys in what Manchester City now has become, and I'm right there with them. Manchester City then, it seems, are here to stay, and long may we reign. City till I die, City till we die. Week in, week out, forget the score. Once it was pride in battle, a fight we could never win, against cartels of corruption and endless Fergie time. First it was Yaya, then that moment in 12. You charmed us in 14, the unthinkable in 18. City are formidables, we did it back to back. To you, Phil Foden, with a chest-thumping big grin. Behind the boys in blue, we'll never give in. Banana skins to sharks, predators on the pitch, a destiny abroad maybe. But at home we must win, time to play catch-up. 125 years so far, but here's where we begin.
We're still here.
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 We're still here. We're still here.
We're still here.
We're still here.
We're still here.
We're still here.
We're still here.